3. Pain and imagining. The subject in the second half of the study is the opposite of what it was in the first half, for what will be attended to is no longer the deconstruction of the world but that world's construction and reconstruction. Thus, the particular structure of activity that will be isolated here is now not unmaking but making. As will very gradually become apparent over the next few chapters, the activity of creation has an identifiable structure. A recognition of that structure requires as only a first step the recognition of the relation between physical pain and imagining. If that relation, described immediately below, echoes our earlier subject, it is because the uncovering of the structure of torture and the structure of war is the uncovering of the inverted form of that relation. It is impossible to speak of either torture or war without attending to the destruction of the artifacts of civilization in either their interior and mental or exterior and modern. Idealized forms, even more significantly, the infliction of pain in torture is inextricably bound up with the generation of a political fiction just as the injuries of war are bound up with the process of conferring facticity on unanchored cultural constructs. Because these events entail the appropriation, aping, and deconstructing of the territory of creating, they entail some of the very elements that will now be looked at in their benign form. When the relation between physical pain and imagining occurs in its forward form, it has the following shape, a shape necessitated by the exceptional place that each has within the psychic arrangements of intentional states and their objects. It was noticed at an early point in this book that physical pain is exceptional in the whole fabric of psychic, somatic, and perceptual states for being the only one that has no object. Though the capacity to experience physical pain is as primal a fact about the human being as is the capacity to hear, to touch, to desire, to fear, to hunger, it differs from these events, and from every other bodily and psychic event, by not having an object in the external world. Hearing and touch are of objects outside the boundaries of the body, as desire is desire of J.C., fear is fear of Y, hunger is hunger for Z, but pain is not of or for anything, it is itself alone. This objectlessness, the complete absence of referential content, almost prevents it from being rendered in language, objectless. It cannot easily be objectified in any form, material or verbal. But it is also its objectlessness that may give rise to imagining by first occasioning the process that eventually brings forth the dense sea of artifacts and symbols that we make and move about in. All other states, precisely by taking an object, at first invite one only to enter rather than to supplement the natural world. The man desiring can see the rain and know it is its cessation that he is longing for, so that he can go out and find the berries he is hungry for, before the night comes that he fears. Because of the inevitable bonding of his own interior states with companion objects in the outside world, he easily locates himself in that external world and has no need to invent a world to extend himself out into. The object is an extension of, an expression of, the state. The rain expresses his longing, the berries his hunger, and the night his fear. But nothing expresses his physical pain. Any state that was permanently objectless would no doubt begin the process of invention. But it is especially appropriate that the very state in which he is utterly objectless is also of all states the one that, by its aversiveness, makes most pressing the urge to move out and away from the body. The only state that is as anomalous as pain is the imagination. While pain is a state remarkable for being wholly without objects, the imagination is remarkable for being the only state that is wholly its objects. There is in imagining no activity, no state, no experienceable condition or felt occurrence separate from the objects. The only evidence that one is imagining is that imaginary objects appear in the mind. Thus, while pain is like seeing or desiring but not like seeing X or desiring B, the opposite but equally extraordinary characteristic belongs to imagining. It is like the X or the Y that are the objects of vision or desire, but not like the felt occurrences of seeing or desiring. While, then, pain is like other forms of sentience but devoid of the self-extension that is ordinarily the counterpart of sentience, the imagination is like other forms of the capacity for self-extension without the experienceable sentience on which it is ordinarily premised. It may well provide an object for other forms of sentience, an imaginary object of hearing, like Ryle's inwardly hummed tune 1, or an imaginary object of touch, the way the perfume on Annie's letter conjures up before Sartre's mind for a brief instant the palpable near proximity of Annie herself too, but the object it provides is never provided for any experienceable form of sentience unique to itself. Point 3. Although the gerund imagining assumes an activity, and although in some philosophic contexts it is described as though it were made up of both an intentional act and an intentional object, for in fact, as has long been intuitively recognized in the centuries-old game played by children and philosophers alike, it is impossible to imagine without imagining something. The attributes that the invisible and itself, apart from its objects, inexperienceable activity of imagining is understood to have, tend to be derived from the attributes of whatever imagined object happened to have been taken as a representable instance of imagining. If, for example, a discussion of imagining takes either Pegasus or a unicorn as its instance of the imagined object, the imagination is then likely to be itself characterized by the qualities of the specified image. Although the unicorn or Pegasus expresses the imagination's freedom from natural occurrence, its ability to rearrange wings and legs into new combinations, and although it expresses as well the imagination's eventual capacity to create beyond need, since neither the unicorn nor Pegasus is striking for its usefulness to people in the 20th century, such an image, by its very frivolity, wrongly suggests that the activity itself is trivial or marginal. That is, discussions conjuring up this type of image tend also to underestimate the centrality and significance of imagining in everyday life. Such an object is especially misleading because it wrongly suggests that the imagination is self-announcing that it is only at work when its object is immediately recognizable as made up. Very different conclusions about the nature of the imagination will be reached if one takes as an indicative object something more richly implicated in everyday life. If, like Sartre, one contemplates not an imagined Pegasus but an imagined Pierre, not a unicorn but an Annie, then the imagination's relation to daily acts of perception as well as its part in the deepest events of loss, love, and friendship are likely to be more immediately recognizable. Point 5. Even here, however, inferences about the nature of the activity that produced the objects will follow from and be limited by the attributes of the chosen objects. Sartre, for example, draws conclusions from the fact that his imagined Pierre is so impoverished by comparison with his real friend Pierre, that his imagined Annie has none of the vibrancy, spontaneity, and limitless depth of presence of the real Annie. But, of course, had he compared his imagined friends not to his real friends when present but to his wholly absent friends, his conclusions would have been supplemented by other, very different conclusions. That is, the imagined Pierre is shadowy, dry, and barely present compared to the real Pierre, but is much more vibrantly present than the absent Pierre, and it was that absence that had excised the introduction of the image both into Sartre's mental life and into his philosophic account of that life. He only began to imagine Pierre because Pierre was away, lost to him, walking in Berlin down streets far beyond Sartre's sensory and perceptual reach, and thus his choice was not between a two-dimensional Pierre and a real Pierre but between a two-dimensional Pierre and a world utterly devoid of, bereft of, that friend's presence. Further, the the same generic embodied imaginer capable of picturing, making present, an absent friend, is also capable of inventing both the idea and the materialized form of the telegraph, as well as devising the specific message, come home at once, as he is also capable of inventing many other mechanisms for transforming the condition of absence into presence, the telephone, train, airplane, all of which originate as the imagination's object. The object that is selected as indicative of the imagination's activity, then, may vary from discussion to discussion, and the attributes that are generalized to the activity tend to be derived from the attributes of the model object. The appropriateness of various kinds of model objects will be returned to at a later moment, but for now the point of central importance is that the imagination is only experienced in the images it produces, and that even discussions of its characteristics as a state tend to be instead discussions of the characteristics of the invoked object. Almost never is the imagination imagined without an object, though the Hebraic scriptures come very close to requiring that believers do just that they apprehend a capacity for creation devoid of any representable content. Attributing to God a representable form is explicitly forbidden, though the objects of mental creation may here be contemplated as the objects that God himself produced, the universe and its inhabitants. The immense problem surrounding that requirement, and the gradual modulation out of that requirement in both the Hebraic and Christian scriptures, will be elaborated in a later chapter. For now, whether the object imagined is God, the imagination itself, Pegasus, the air, Annie, a unicorn, a wall, a telegram, or an airplane, the activity producing the object tends to be coterminous with and only knowable through that object. Physical pain, then, is an intentional state without an intentional object. Imagining is an intentional object without an experienceable intentional state. Thus, it may be that in some peculiar way it is appropriate to think of pain as the imagination's intentional state, and to identify the imagination as pain's intentional object. Of course, it is probably inaccurate to identify an essentially objectless state as an intentional state without an object, since only by having an object does it exist as an intentional state. In isolation, pain intends nothing, it is wholly passive, it is suffered rather than willed or directed. To be more precise, one can say that pain only becomes an intentional state once it is brought into relation with the objectivating power of the imagination. Through that relation, pain will be transformed from a wholly passive and helpless occurrence into a self-modifying and, when most successful, self-eliminating one. But to argue that physical pain and imagining belong to one another as each other's missing intentional counterpart seems only to argue that hurting and an imagined asterisk may occur together in a closed loop of interior occurrence that is a structural analog for other intentional acts like hearing a voice, touching a window pane, whereas it seems possible that something much more important is occurring here. What may instead be the case is that pain and imagining constitute extreme conditions of, on the one hand, intentionality as a state and, on the other, intentionality as self-objectification, and that between these two boundary conditions all the other more familiar, binary acts and objects are located. That is, pain and imagining are the framing events within whose boundaries all other perceptual, somatic, and emotional events occur. Thus, between the two extremes can be mapped the whole terrain of the human psyche. That this is an appropriate and useful way of understanding the relation between pain and the imagination is suggested by a number of observable phenomena. The more a habitual form of perception is experienced as itself rather than its external object, the closer it lies to pain. Conversely, the more completely a state is experienced as its object, the closer it lies to imaginative self-transformation. So, for example, a woman, perhaps her name is Ruth, working in the fields, touching the wheat, feels not only the wheat but her fingers touching. Touch, as is recognized in traditional descriptions of the senses, lies closer to pain than does vision. Looking across the fields, she is filled with images of grain, though to some degree the perceptual event is feelable as occurring in a horizontal band between her cheekbones and her forehead. She tends to experience there the sheaves of wheat and barley rather than any self-conscious state of feeling in her eyes. It is because vision and hearing are, under ordinary conditions, so exclusively bound up with their object rather than their bodily location that they are the senses most frequently invoked by poets as the sensory analogs for the imagination. Through them, one seems to become disembodied, either because one seems to have been transported hundreds of feet beyond the edges of the body out into the external world, or instead because the images of objects from the external world have themselves been carried into the interior of the body as perceptual content, and seem to reside there, displacing the dense matter of the body itself. But while forms of perception, like touch and vision, can be differentiated from one another by the relative degree of emphasis within them on the feeling state or instead on the object, any one of them in isolation contains the potential for being experienced either as state or as object, and thus has within it the fluidity of moving now toward the vicinity of hurting, now toward the vicinity of imagining. Although vision and hearing ordinarily reside close to objectification, if one experiences one's eyes warriors themselves, if the woman working looks up at the sun too suddenly and her eyes fill with blinding light, then vision falls back to the neighborhood of pain. Or if the objects in the external field, the grain, the figures of other workers, the trees off to the side begin one year to appear distorted or blurred to her, that is, if the objects begin to become lost to her, she will cease to experience vision only as objectified interior content, and will begin to become more self-conscious of the event of seeing itself. She no longer experiences the images of grain, persons, and trees without also experiencing her own body in the mode of aversiveness and deprivation, a deprivation that in its most extreme form is physical pain. So, too, though touch always has both somatic and external content, it may be experienced now more as one, now more as the other, and the more it is experienced as the first, the closer it lies to pain, the more it is experienced as the other, the closer it lies to self-displacement and transformation. Thus, if a thorn cuts through the skin of the woman's finger, she feels not the thorn but her body hurting her. If instead she experiences across the skin of her fingers not the awareness of the feel of those fingers but the feel of the fine weave of another woman's work, or if she traces the lettering of an engraved message and becomes mindful not of events in her hands but of the form and motivating force of the signs, or if that night she experiences the intense feelings across the skin of her body not as her own body but as the intensely feelable presence of her beloved, she in each of these moments experiences the sensation of touch not as bodily sensations but as self-displacing, self-transforming objectification, and so far are these moments from physical pain, that if they are named as bodily occurrences at all, they will be called pleasure, a word usually reserved either for moments of overt disembodiment or, as here, moments when acute bodily sensations are experienced as something other than one's own body. Point 6. The topography of act and object in sensation and perception is even more immediately recognizable as a description of emotional and somatic states. A state of consciousness other than pain such as hunger or desire will, if deprived of its object, begin to approach the neighborhood of pain, as in acute, unsatisfied hunger or prolonged, objectless longing. Conversely, when such a state is given an object, it is itself experienced as a pleasurable and self-eliminating, or more precisely, Pleasurable because self-eliminating. Physical occurrence. Point 7. The interior states of physical hunger and psychological desire have nothing aversive, fearful, or unpleasant about them if the person experiencing them inhabits a world where food is bountiful and a companion is near. While it may be immediately apparent in these examples why it is appropriate to identify the objectless state of consciousness as approaching the condition of pain, 8. The appropriateness of identifying the objectified state with the opposite framing boundary of imagining may be less immediately apparent since, in the examples given, the sources of objectification, wheat to eat, another human being to love, golden fields to see, originate in the natural world. Point 9. The appropriateness of the identification, however, arises from the fact that beyond the expansive ground of ordinary, naturally occurring objects is the narrow extra ground of imagined objects, and beyond this ground, there is no other. Imagining is, in effect, the ground of last resort. That is, should it happen that the world fails to provide an object, the imagination is there, almost on an emergency standby basis, as a last resource for the generation of objects. Missing, they will be made up, and though they may sometimes be inferior to naturally occurring objects, they will always be superior to naturally occurring objectlessness. If no food is present, imagining grain or berries will, at least temporarily, allow the hunger to be experienced as potentially positive rather than as wholly aversive, and the imagined image may remind the person to walk over the next hill to find real wheat and berries. The transformation of hunger into eating, a transformation in which there is a literal displacement of the passive, aversive sensation of hunger by the active incorporation of external objects into the body, no longer requires the self-announcing presence of objects, because if they are not themselves sensorially present to vision, they will present themselves to the imagination, and will motivate either a search, an alteration in the ground of the world, or an act of material invention, an introduction of a new object onto the ground of the world. Similarly, imagining a companion if the world provides none, may at least temporarily prevent longing from being a wholly self-experiencing set of physical arid emotional events that, emptied of any referential content, exist as merely painful inner disturbances. It may be that dreaming, too, should be understood in this way, as sustaining the objectifying powers of people during the hours when they are cut off from the natural source of objects, so that they do not during sleep drown in their own corporeal engulfment. That is, the particular content of the dream images, now terrifying, now benign, now full of uncanny secret intelligence about the sleeper, now ignorant, arbitrary, and nonsensical, is itself insignificant beside the overall fact of the dreaming itself, the emergency work of the imagination to provide an object, this object, that object, RD object to sustain and to exercise the capacity for self-objectification during the sleep-filled hours of sweet and dangerous bodily absorption. The appropriateness of identifying imagining as a boundary condition of intentionality may, then, be recognized in the fact that imagining provides an extra and extraordinary ground of objects beyond the naturally occurring ground. It actively intends, authors, or sponsors objects when they are not possibly available as an already existing given. But the appropriateness of the identification may also be understood by phrasing the relation in the opposite direction, rather than apprehending the imagination as an extreme miming of the ordinary given condition in other forms of consciousness. Other forms of consciousness can be understood to entail more moderate and modest acts of the authoring, self-alteration, and self-artifice routinely and dramatically at work in imagining. If one takes hurting and an imagined object, for example, acute thirst and an imagined cup of water, as intentional counterparts, and if one sees the two together as one in a series of intentional events, acute thirst and an imagined cup of water, touching a flower, hearing a baby cry, watching a train, fearing a storm -, it may at first seem that its essential relation between state and object, where the object comes into existence specifically to eliminate the condition, differs fundamentally from the relation between state and object in all the other examples, in each of which state and object coexist as ongoing counterparts. But even these other ordinary perceptual and emotional acts entail self-alteration and artifice. Although in seeing a field, the field is not taken in order to nullify the act of seeing, the way water is imagined in order to eliminate the thirst, or a blanket is imagined in order to eliminate the state of being cold, the person may well change the direction of his gaze, and thus see the city to his left in order to displace, eliminate, his seeing the field. Ordinary perception is self-modifying because, at the very least, it alters and nullifies its own content, continually exchanging one object for another, exercising control over the direction and content of touch, hearing, seeing, smell, and taste. Thus the radical alteration that occurs in the landscape of the natural world in pain and imagining being on a desert and hallucinating a tree-filled oasis, dying of thirst and seeing water on the next sand dune is habitually mimed in daily acts of shifting one seeing to the east rather than the west, reaching out to touch the objects on the left rather than those on the right, attending to the sounds coming from the room above rather than the room below. Further, it may be that the cancellation not only of the object but of the interior state itself is occurring in ordinary perception since the person tends to alter the object of touch, vision, or taste precisely at the moment when he becomes self-conscious of the bodily state itself, that is, when the already given object fails to permit the ongoing achievement of self-objectification, throwing his attention back onto the body. If the sun is too bright for a woman's eyes, she moves into the shade, and as she does, her eyes again fill with seeable objects rather than aversive sensation. If in turn the shade grows too dark for her to differentiate, without straining, the seeds she is sorting, she moves back out into the light. She may shift her vision to some nearby children to ease her discomfort at remembering her lost child, or if that only makes her more acutely self-conscious of her loss, she may watch some birds. Instead, through her relation to these objects, she continually modifies the degree to which she displaces self-consciousness with unself-conscious objectified content. So too in somatic and emotional states like hunger and desire, a person can continually modify the state itself, now minimizing it, now letting it occur, now intensifying, and as you attaining it, now eliminating it altogether by continually modifying and adjusting his or her relation to the object. A third characteristic of the relation between imaginary and real objects that reveals the appropriateness of identifying imagining as a framing state of intentionality at the edge of the human world opposite to the boundary formed by physical pain is that the imagination seems to provide a standard for judging the acceptability of objects in the naturally given world. The more exactly the object of desire or hunger or fear fits or expresses the state, the more precise a projection of the state it is, the more will it seem to have been generated by the interior state itself and will it be considered a visionary solution. That is, one of the distinguishing features of the made world, as opposed to the natural world, is that it is brought forth for the precise purpose of being the objects of these states, to be a precise fit, and so when a naturally occurring event seems to have this quality of fit, it seems to belong to the made world. Conversely, the less the object accommodates and expresses the inner requirements of the hunger, desire, or fear, the less there is an object for the state and only the state itself, the more it will approach the condition of pain. The more perfectly Boaz fits the inner shape of Ruth's desire, the more will he seem a kinsman and companion brought forth for her hot by a bountiful earth but by a bountiful heaven, by, that is, willed artifice. The less he fits those interior claims, the more will she reside in those interior claims and the more she will suffer. That the imagination is somehow implicated in assessments of objectification does not mean that made objects are preferable to natural objects, for one may very much prefer the given, raw wheat, raw berries, to the artificial, wheat bread, berry jam, berry dumplings, berry pie, whiskey, berry cider, berry wine, and so forth, but it does mean that the very preferability of natural objects at a given moment is itself recognizable because the standard of perfect fit has been established. But the full array of natural and imagined objects that collectively accommodate hunger in all the varying degrees of its insistence, the nuanced petulance of its claims. This is also true of most other states, and so it is familiar to hear people express their amazement at the natural world by an implicit reference to an imaginary standard. This stone looks like it was handmade. I cannot imagine any a more kind person. The wind in the trees looks like the principle of intelligence itself. There could not be a planet more physically beautiful than Earth. That pain and the imagination are each other's missing intentional counterpart, and that they together provide a framing identity of man as creator within which all other intimate perceptual, psychological, emotional, and somatic events occur, is perhaps most succinctly suggested by the fact that there is one piece of language used in many different languages at once as a near synonym for pain, and as a near synonym for created object, and that is the word work. The deep ambivalence of the meaning of work in Western civilization has often been commented upon, for it has tended to be perceived at once as pain's twin and as its opposite, in its Hebrew and Greek etymological origins, in our spoken myths and unspoken intuitions, and in our tradition of religious and philosophic analysis. It has been repeatedly placed by the side of physical suffering, yet has, at the same time and almost as often, been placed in the company of pleasure. Art, imagination, civilization phenomena that in varying degrees express man's expansive possibility, the movement out into the world that is the opposite of pain's contract active potential. Point 10. Any sense that this duality is arbitrary dissolves when work is seen against the full array of intentional acts and objects. For work, like all the intentional states looked at above but to a much greater degree than was apprehensible there, conforms to the same arrangement. The more it realizes and transforms itself in its object, the closer it is to the imagination, to art, to culture, the more it is unable to bring forth an object or, bringing it forth, is then cut off from its object, the more it approaches the condition of pain. So, as an example of the one extreme, is the fact that the collective artifacts of civilization, its paintings, poems, buildings are habitually referred to individually as works. Indicative of the opposite extreme is the fact that historical moments when work has been identified with suffering have been moments in which those persons performing the activity of work have been separated from the benefits of the objects that are the product of that activity. Slavery, whether occurring in ancient Egypt or in the 19th century American South, was an arrangement in which physical work was demanded of a population whose members were themselves cut off from ownership, control, and enjoyment of the products they produced. So, too, the 19th century British factory world is one in which work is described as approaching the condition of pain, not only in the extensive writings of Marx but in the British parliamentary blue books on which he relied so heavily. The proximity of work to pain is here specifically attributed to the massive hunger, sores, disease, airlessness, and exhaustion suffered by the industrial population, but all these conditions are in turn attributed to the more fundamental shattering of the essential integrity of act and object in the human psyche, for the body at work was separated from the objects of its work, the men, women, and children bringing forth out of their labor a multitude of objects, coal, lace, bricks, shirts, watches, pins, paper, plated straw, themselves inhabited a space wholly outside the realm on which those objects conferred their benefit, a realm that belonged to a set of people who had not themselves directly participated in the making of the objects. Point 11. Far more than any other intentional state, work approximates the framing events of pain and the imagination, for it consists of both an extremely embodied physical act, an act which, even in non-physical labor, engages the whole psyche, and of an object that was not previously in the world, a fishing net or piece of lace where there had been none, or a mended net or repaired lace curtain where there had been only a torn approximation, or a sentence or a paragraph or a poem where there had been silence. Work and its work, or work and its object, its artifact, are the names that are given to the phenomena of pain and the imagination as they begin to move from being a self-contained loop within the body to becoming the equivalent loop now projected into the external world. It is through this movement out into the world that the extreme privacy of the occurrence, both pain and imagining, are invisible to anyone outside the bound areas of the person's body, begins to be shareable, that sentience becomes social, and thus acquires its distinctly human form. In this process of externalization, each of the two components is itself diminished, which is in the one case a great benefit and in the other only an apparent loss. Although the activity of work may itself at any given historical moment involve a degree of aversiveness in which it begins to be identical with physical pain. 12. It is by no means an internal requirement of the activity that it have this aversive intensity, and it does not ordinarily do so. It does, however, under all circumstances, and regardless of whether it is primarily physical or mental labor, entail the much more moderate, and now willed, directed, and controlled, embodied aversiveness of exertion, prolonged effort, and exhaustion. It hurts to work. Thus, the wholly passive and acute suffering of physical pain becomes the self-regulated and modest suffering of work. Work is, then, a diminution of pain. The aversive intensity of pain becomes in work controlled discomfort. So, too, imagining achieves a moderated form in the material and verbal artifacts that are the objects of work. If, for example, a person standing in a field imagines himself to be instead standing by the sea, he has, in imagining, brought about a large alteration in the world, displacing the whole physically asterisk given context with an invented one. If, in contrast, he fashions out of the clay of the ground a cup and introduces this new object into the field, he has again brought about an alteration in the physically given world, but a much more modest one than in the first case. While imagining may entail a revolution of the entire order of things, the eclipse of the given by a total reinvention of the world, an artifact, a relocated piece of coal, a sentence, a cup, a piece of lace, is a fragment of world alteration. Imagining a city, the human being makes a house. Imagining a political utopia, he or she instead helps to build a country. Imagining the elimination of suffering from the world, the person instead nurses a friend back to health. Although, however, artifice is more modest and fragmentary than imagining, its objects have the immense advantage over imagined objects of being real, and because real, shareable, and because the objects are shareable, in the end artifice has a scale as large as that in imagining because its outcome is for the first time collective. That is, if there were 100 persons, each of whom imagined himself the inventor of a town, each would find that he could instead in a given week only make a few hundred bricks, or construct part of a wagon, or clear a piece of a road. But because each person's made objects now inhabit the shareable external space outside his own body accessible to all, the objects he makes can be coupled with those objects made by the second person, and the third, and so the large imagined town gets made. In imagining the town, each person had to invent and sustain the image individually, and thus the 100 persons continually duplicated each other's efforts. Further, for any one person to make the town continually available to himself, he had to devote each day to sustaining the image, and then the next day, day after day, reinvent it once more. In the collective work of artifice, in contrast, the town becomes a freestanding object. It no longer depends for its existence on the mental labor of daily reinvention. Thus the imaginers may move on to other projects. It may be that in the year the town was being built, more focused and sustained exertion was required than would have been required by 100 persons daydreaming about a town day after day for 365 days, but in the long run, the effort required to perpetuate the fantasy city would be much greater, since the act would have to be sustained and renewed over 50 years, while those who built the town will in 49 of those years be free of its daily reinvention, except for now and then when it needs to be repaired. The advantage of material culture over a culture of belief is, as will be elaborated in a later chapter, difficult to overstate. In work, then, pain is moderated into sustained discomfort, and the objects of imagining, though individually moderated into fragmentary artifacts, are collectively translated into the structures of civilization that have nothing modest about them. In the attempt to uncover the structure of creation in later chapters, the assumed starting point will be the framing relation of intentionality, described either as pain and imagining or work and its artifacts. There is one additional word that changes in the movement back and forth between these two sets of companion terms, and that should be briefly clarified before starting. The elementary place occupied by the image of the weapon in the first set of terms is the place held by the tool in the second set of terms, the projection into intentionality. Through the mediation of agency in the pain weapon imagined object arrangement, which is in its deconstructed form, the pain weapon power arrangement becomes now the work tool artifact arrangement. The modulation of the weapon into the tool has some of the same characteristics as the modulation of the embodied experience of pain into the embodied activity of work, or as the modulation of an imagined object into a materialized or verbalized artifact, but it also has some additional characteristics. That the sign of the weapon has an elementary place in the transformation of pain into the projected image was suggested earlier, and was described both in its beneficent and, more elaborately, in its deconstructed form. Point 13. Although in its benign form the displacement of aversive sentience with the disembodied content of objectified images eventually entails an infinite array of images, and although it is not possible to travel back into the origins of human imagining and chart the chronological sequence in which such images first appeared, there are many outwardly visible indications that the image of the weapon is not just one among thousands of signs but is a sign occupying a primal place in the original moment of transformation. Of such outward indications, perhaps the most important to recall here is the centrality of the image in the language of people in physical pain. Physical pain is not only itself resistant to language but also actively destroys language, deconstructing it into the pre-language of cries and groans. To hear those cries is to witness the shattering of language. Conversely, to be present when the person in pain rediscovers speech and so regains his powers of self-objectification is almost to be present at the birth, or rebirth, of language. That the person in pain very typically moves through a handful of descriptive words to an as-if construction, and an as-if construction that has a weapon on the other side, indicates the primacy of the sign in the elementary work of projection into metaphor. To describe one's hurt in an image of agency is to project it into an object which, though at first conceived of as moving toward the body, by its very separability from the body becomes an image that can be lifted away, carrying some of the attributes of pain with it. Point 14. The primacy of this sign in the projection of human pain into disembodied imagining will, in the next chapter, be more elaborately attended to as it occurs in the Hebraic scriptures, where the relationship between the people and their imagined object, God, is repeatedly represented as a relation between a deeply embodied, suit-furring human being and a wholly disembodied, i.e., immune from pain, principle of creating, mediated by the recurring image of the colossal weapon that transverses the space between them. The only path connecting the body and the power of creating is apprehended as the vertical line running along the edge of a weapon whose one end is on the ground and whose other end is in heaven. On the other side of the concrete, imaginable image and unimaginable, contentless creator is apprehended to exist. It is also useful to recall that the weapon as a materialized artifact is usually assumed to have been present at the infancy of culture. Long before man extends himself out into the world by making other artifacts, he extends himself out into that world by holding onto a found object, stick, stone, that increases, extends, the length and strength of his arm. This weapon may itself be modified into a tool, or the tool back into a weapon, and it is the identity of the two, as well as the profound mental distance separating them, that must for a moment be held steadily visible. The weapon and the tool seem at moments indistinguishable, for they may each reside in a single physical object. Even the clenched fist of a human hand may be either a weapon or a tool, and may be quickly transformed back and forth, now into the one, now into the other. At the same time, however, the gulf of meaning, intention, connotation, and tone separates them. If one holds the two side by side in front of the mind, a hand, as weapon, and a hand, as tool, a knife, weapon, and a knife, tool, a hammer, and a hammer, an axe and an axe, it is then clear that what differentiates them is not the object itself but the surface on which they fall. What we call a weapon when it acts on a sentient surface we call a tool when it acts on a non-sentient surface. The hand that pounds a human face is a weapon, and the hand that pounds the dough for bread or the clay for a bowl is a tool. The knife that enters the cow or the horse is a weapon. And the knife that cuts through the no longer alive meat at dinner is a tool. The axe that cuts through the back of a wolf is a weapon, and the axe that cuts through a tree is a tool. The hammer that hammers a man to a cross is a weapon, and the hammer used to construct the cross itself is a tool. Although one can conceive of exceptions to this basis of differentiation, the exceptions tend to reaffirm the distinction, as well as to call attention to its complexities. If, for example, someone were to object that the axe that cuts through the tree, in the preceding examples, should be called a weapon rather than a tool, the person making the objection would almost certainly turn out to be one who believes that the vegetable world is sentient and capable of experiencing some form of pain. Conversely, if one were to object that the knife that cuts through the cow is a tool, the person would be someone who has retracted the privileges of sentience from the animal world and thinks of cows as already food and therefore, not quite alive, as we more routinely think of trees as not keep alive. If an axe strikes the side of a house, that axe may, especially to those whose home it is, be perceived as a weapon even though it acts on a non-sentient surface, but this identification itself exposes the fact that we think of human artifacts as extensions of sentient human beings and as thus themselves protected by the privileges accorded sentience. Again, there are certain instruments, such as those in medicine and dentistry, that we call tools even though they enter human tissue, but Should be noticed that this identification is learned and that even after it is learned, it requires a conscious mental act to hold steady. The perception, which violates all intuition, of the object as a tool. Every child recognizes it as a weapon and responds accordingly. Even adults tend to watch the approach of the knife toward an arm with complete equanimity only if they know that the tissue of the arm has been anesthetized and thus made almost non-sentient. Similarly, contemporary arguments about whether abortion is properly understood as a medical operation, tool, or instead as a murder, weapon, have sometimes turned on the question of whether or not the fetus is capable of experiencing pain. Point 15. These and many other concrete instances work to reaffirm the mental and moral distance separating sentient and non-sentient surfaces, a distance so great that the object acting on them is perceived and named as two different objects. If one imagines oneself back at an early moment in culture during which a large knife is suspended above a child, Isaac, Iphigenia, any child, and if before the knife falls, the child is moved out of that space and an animal, goat, or lamb, is put in its place, that moment of substitution will be recognizable as one that has always, in the retrospective accounts of the culture which followed, been designated a revolutionary moment in the growth of moral consciousness. But if one now holds steadily visible not two pictures but three pictures, the child and the knife looming above, giving way to the lamb and the knife looming above, and now in turn the lamb is moved out of that location and replaced by a block of wood under the still looming knife, so great in the transition from the second to the third picture is the revolution in consciousness that the object itself is now reperceived as a wholly different object, a tool rather than a weapon, and the anticipated action of the object is no longer an act of wounding but an act of creating. This difference will be returned to after looking for a moment at a characteristic that remains common to the two objects. The power of alteration resides equally in weapons and in tools. In each there is a tremendous distance between what is occurring at the two ends, not simply because one end is active and the other passive, but because a fairly inconsequential alteration at one end is magnified into an occurrence full of consequence at the other. A small shift in the body at one end of a gun, so small it is almost imperceptible, only the position of one finger moves, can wholly shatter a body at its other end. The pressure of a hand pushing on the handle of a knife, itself too small to alter, to dent, to scar, even slightly the surface of the handle, will as it begins to be transferred and concentrated across the broad half-inch of the handle to the drastically thin surface edge of the blade, be magnified into a huge power of altering whatever surface it touches at its other end. Thus the object, whether weapon or tool, is a lever across which a comparatively small change in the body at one end is amplified into a very large change in the object, animate or inanimate, at the other end. A person using a weapon or a tool can therefore take credit for, experience * a large alteration without himself experiencing any direct bodily alteration. He experiences alteration without himself risking the aversiveness that ordinarily accompanies self-alteration. He objectifies his presence in the world through the alterability of his world. The difference in the alteration that occurs at each end of a weapon or tool is one not just of scale but of duration. The cut made by a sword or a scythe is not only a much greater change than is that of the motion of the lifted arm that caused it, but it also lasts far longer than that arm motion. In addition to whatever practical benefits are gained by hurting an enemy or harvesting grain, there is a magnification of the actor because he has brought about an alteration not only larger than the one he himself experienced but of much greater duration. Whatever assertion of selfhood might be carried by his performing that lift and swing of his arm over and over again in an unbroken sequence over a week, can instead, if there was a tool or weapon held in his hand, be accomplished by a single movement of the arm, for now the alteration itself, the cut grain or the unhealed wound, is the freestanding sign of THDT. Momentary motion that itself endures for a week. The altered object becomes a record that prevents the action from having to be endlessly repeated, presence is registered and need not be continually reenacted. Although the primary basis for differentiating a weapon and a tool is that the one acts on a sentient and the other on a non-sentient surface, a more precise account would say that the tool, too, acts on a sentient surface but in a delayed way. The making of an artifact is a social act, for the object, whether an artwork or instead an object of everyday use, is intended as something that will both enter into and itself elicit human responsiveness. Though the tool does not, like a weapon, act directly on the human body, it does so at 2 or 3 steps removed. Marks on a series of trees register the marker's presence as though he stood in all those places. They allow him to inhabit a space much larger than the small circle of his immediately present body. Those marks are now part of the visual field of anyone else who approaches the grove of trees. Rather than using a weapon on someone's eyes, the world is rebuilt or represented, even if only modestly altered, in such a way that it must be reseen. That is, rather than directly altering sentience, as occurs in the use of a weapon on a living body, the tool alters sentience by providing objects of sentience. It alters without hurting, often even bringing about the diminution of hurt. Through tools and acts of making, human beings become implicated in each other's sentience. Seeing is seeing of ch3, and the one who has made the ch3 has entered into the interior of the other person seeing, entered there in the object of perception. The objects of hearing, desire, hunger, touch, are not just passively grasped by the fixed intentional states, the objects themselves act on the state, sometimes initiating the state, sometimes modifying it, increasing, decreasing, or eliminating it. Thus when intentional objects come to include not just the rain, berries, stones, and the night but also bread, bowls, church steeples, and radiators, there comes to be an ongoing interaction at the, once private, center of human sentience, for not only are the interior facts of sentience projected outward into the artifact in the moment of its making, but conversely those artifacts now enter the interior of other persons as the content of perception and emotion. Thus in the transformation of a weapon into a tool, everything is gained and nothing is lost. One final attribute of the tool in the constellation of work-tool artifact is that it is itself the concrete record of the connection between the worker and the object of his order work. It is the path from the object back to its sentient source. It is the path that if eclipsed from attention allows the object to be severed from its source. This special position of the tool becomes more apparent when work is seen within the framework of intentionality. Work is an intentional act. Its object, whether a carved statue or a chunk of coal lifted out of the earth, is an intentional object. The tool, as is visible in its two ends, shares characteristics of each. At once act and object, it can be assimilated in either direction. It belongs to the body and is an extension of the human hand. It is also itself an object, the earliest made object, perhaps preceded only by the weapon, which must itself be made before it can participate in the making of other objects. Point 16. The tool, then, occupies a remarkable position within the intentional frame. In almost all intentional states other than work, the connection between act and object is invisible and magical, signaled only by a preposition, the of asterisk and the for in fear offs, hunger for why, that is a placeholder and a zero. In work, the locus of the connection becomes for the first time palpable and concrete in the tool. Across its concrete surface, the interior act and the exterior object become continuous, the and the for themselves become subject to direction and control. The benefits to sentience are incalculable. In the following chapters, there will begin to emerge a more complete account of the interior structure of the act of creating as it is objectified and made knowable in the hidden interior of the created object. As the nature of making becomes visible, the significance of unmaking looked at in the first half of this book will itself be more fully apprehended. One of the central problems in exposing the interior of making, which will be called here imagining when the activity and its object are interior, and making or creating when the activity is extended into the external world and has as its outcome a material or verbal artifact, is, as suggested earlier, the selection of an appropriate model object. Unmaking resides in and can thus be represented by two relatively self-contained events, torture and war, the first of which is its most complete and therefore most perfect representative. But where is the equivalent representative of making, which manifests itself everywhere, which seems on the one hand fully present in the most fragile and singular of outcomes, a pencil, a white shirt, a clothespin, room, or curtain, yet seems on the other only to be fully present in the overarching structures of civilization whose scale places them beyond it. Reach of sensory as well as, perhaps, of intellectual apprehension? Any model object asterisk will be inadequate, either by being too diminutive and fragmentary, or by being too large for description, and the discussion that follows will minimize the problem only by distributing the error in both directions, now erring on the side of the large, now erring on the side of the small, thus moving back and forth between what is fully representative but not representable and what is easily representable but not truly representative. This alternation is itself made easier by the fact that the structure of making appears to remain constant across such changes in scale. The logic governing the selection of individual material artifacts as model objects will become apparent as those objects are invoked here and there throughout Chapter 4 and centrally in Chapter 5. Such objects, now a blanket, now an altar, now a chair, a coat, or a bulb, will be presented in the context of their own self-evident characteristics as well as characteristics consciously or unconsciously attributed to them in, for example, literature and law. A verbal artifact, such as a story or a legal argument, may itself comment on and expose the nature of a material artifact, such as a city or a pen whistle or an artificial heart. Thus the specific logic of invoking any one of them need not be anticipated here. The logic underlying the selection of fragments from the overarching structure of civilization may not, in contrast, be self-evident when it is encountered in Chapter 4, and so will be very briefly indicated here. Because the deconstruction of creation takes a specifically political form, torture, or, it might seem most appropriate to trace the outlines of the opposite event again in a specifically political form, such as the moment when a new country is being conceived and constructed, made up, made real, or when an already existing country, having been partially destroyed, is being reimagined and reconstructed, remade up. As it happens, the human imagination has given a fairly complete account of itself at both such moments. The creating of a country, for example the United States, is knowable, after the fact, in the freestanding artifact that was its outcome, the United States itself and more. Particularly, its constitution, but in addition the actual present tense activity of creating in this instance produced not only an object, a constitution, a country, but also a record of its own present tense action. In the pages of the Federalist Papers, it is possible to see the outline of the act of creation, in part because Madison, Hamilton, and Jay so self-consciously recognized themselves as engaged in an act of invention, as when Madison stops to differentiate men from angels on the basis that each is self-governing but the first only achieves this through materialized design 17 or when Hamilton, calling attention to the interior structure of the edifice we are here invited to erect, 18, explicitly refers to the nation as a made object. Similarly, the recreating or reconstructing of partially destroyed nations has a surviving record of both its initial moment of conception and its successive modifications in the written documents and oral history surrounding the Marshall Plan, the Plan for European Economic Recovery, and the European Common Market. If the period between 1939 and 1945 is conventionally identified as one of the darkest in Western civilization, then there can also be taken as one of its most luminous the period of years during which Europe was rebuilt, and, in particular, one 48-hour period beginning on June 5, 1947 when a quiet speech given before a small audience at an American university set off throughout the night on a faraway continent a series of phone calls between various heads of state who, in a sudden swell of amazement, disbelief, and visionary trust, found themselves, though still standing in the midst of massive rubble, poverty, hunger, and anticipated cold, imagining there in the middle of the night a restored Europe, and imagining as well the still only imaginary path by which they would get there found themselves also, perhaps, recognizing in some dim corner of their minds that the United States Secretary of State may have been only speaking hypothetically, may have been only introducing an as-if clause in the presence of its listeners, but found themselves realizing too, as though participating in a benign conspiracy with some larger, intercontinental imagination, that Europe could invoke its own as-if clause, and by acting as if the United States quite simply meant what it said, the hypothetical would become real, regardless of original intention. Point 19 in any event, within one 48-hour period, the United States had supposed, and Europe had begun to act on the supposition. In both the Federalist Papers and the Plan for European Economic Recovery, the work of the human imagination in constructing large units of civilization, for here the unit of shelter is not a room or a house but a country or a continent, is at moments exposed even in the fundamental framing relation between pain and imagining, for in the first the United States is being described in its conceptual infancy, and thus both the fragility of union and its anticipated strength are co-present on every page. Similarly, the success of European recovery was premised on an almost unprecedented willingness on the part of each of the participants to expose its own inner fragility, for the first time in modern history. Marshall noted, representatives of 16 nations collectively disclosed their internal economic conditions and facilities and undertook, subject to stated conditions, to do certain things for the mutual benefit of all 20. Nevertheless, to step into the intricacies of either the Federalist Papers or the Plan for European Economic Recovery is to walk into the middle of the civilizing process when many of its fundamental assumptions are already securely in place, and thus in no need of articulation, and thus not themselves self-announcing. Equally important, though the generic events of torture and war are opposed by the civilizing impulse even when that impulse has a specific and small location, manifesting itself in something as fragmentary as a table, and though, therefore, it is also opposed by the making of something more expansive, like a nation or a group of nations, it is nevertheless misleading to focus on a particular country or continent at a given historical moment, since insofar as they have a true opposite, it is civilization itself. If Western civilization is characterized by a long list of attributes, two that must occupy a central position in any list are first, its Judeo-Christian framework of belief, and second, its insistent thrust toward material self-expression. These two attributes have in part guided the selection of the two texts that are invoked in Chapter 4, the Judeo-Christian scriptures and the writings of Marx, in each of which the nature of creating the relation between body and image, body and belief, body and artifact is endlessly puzzled over, looked at now from one side and now from another, now from below and now from above, held up before the mind and turned over and around so that all its intricacies and edges become visible. Although the logic of invoking the biblical writings may seem self-evident, the logic of invoking the writings of Marx may seem less so, for Marx is in the United States so often narrowly perceived in his capacity as critic of Western economic structures that it is sometimes forgotten that he is our major philosopher on the nature of material objects, that he not only accepts but embraces and applauds the Western impulse toward material self-objectification, and that he himself, though an angry opponent of what he perceived to be its injustices, accepted perhaps 90% of its materialist premises. Even that part of his work that is revolutionary should probably be seen as what Jacob Tallman has called the Western heresy, 21 a heresy through which Western materialist assumptions have been exported to non-Western cultures, a vehicle through which a constellation of premises embedded in materialism has been carried into what were originally less materially centered, or non-material, even in some instances anti-material, societies. If this description is accurate, then his relation to the West is not unlike the relation of Christianity to Judaism, for although there must have been a day long ago when Christianity was perceived as a radical rejection of Jewish belief, at a distance of 2,000 years it is self-evident that Christianity accepted 90% of Judaic assumptions, and by means of the 10% by which it strayed, itself became the vehicle through which a stunning artifact invented in a tiny corner of the Mediterranean could be extended out over an entire hemisphere, conferring its benefits not only on the tiny population who were racially related to the original imaginers, but to the populations of several continents, for the relation between the believer and the object of belief no longer depended on the disposition of genetic material residing in the body of the believer. Although one of these writings appears relatively early in the civilization it helped to sponsor and the other relatively late, in both of them elementary attributes of the nature of creating are made visible because in neither of them is anything silently assumed. In each an extended meditation on the nature of human making is occasioned by the recognition of a problem in the already existing realm of artifice, the largest created object, God in one case, the overarching economic and ideological structures of society in the other, is perceived to be either insufficiently reciprocating or insufficiently self-substantiating, and is thus itself subjected to a process of modification in the course of the meditation. In both works, there is a recognition that the strategies of wounding and creating have become conflated, and the work of differentiating and holding the two securely separate in the mind comes to depend on the controlling and redirecting of the referential activity of the sign of the weapon or tool, the sign that precisely because of its inherent instability has allowed the partial deconstruction of making into unmaking. Although at the starting point of the analysis that follows, problems analogous to those encountered in earlier chapters will be re-encountered, these texts very quickly carry us to new territory of understanding. The language in which the scriptural and Marxist explorations occur requires no translation into the terms that are of central concern in the present study, for in each of them the overt and undisguised subject matter is that of creating, creator, body, artifact, working, hurting, maker. The only new term introduced into this otherwise familiar list is the word believing, which, in its biblical context, is close to being a synonym for what has been called here imagining. To believe is to perpetuate the imagined object across a succession of days, weeks, and years. Belief is the capacity to sustain the imagined, or apprehended, object in one's own psyche, even when there is no sensorially available confirmation that that object has any existence independent of one's own interior mental activity. Because both of these writings take making as their central subject, and because both so regularly traverse the full expanse of ground that separates the extreme framing condition of the body in physical pain from the opposite framing condition of self-objectification as it occurs in its most extended and ample of artifacts, the Judeo-Christian and Marxist narratives themselves become perhaps to a degree not equaled by any other two texts in the West epic explorations of the human imagination.